There's a quiet truth that explains almost everything about our world, a truth hidden not in grand battles or royal courts, but in the simple lines drawn across maps. These lines move money, goods, and ideas with a force greater than any army. The truth is this: civilizations are shaped not by borders, but by connections. By the routes that link them, and the corridors through which their wealth must flow. Every empire that ever existed, Persia, Rome, the Mongols, Britain, the Ottomans, rose because it controlled the movement of something valuable. Grain, gold, silk, spices, oil, information. And every empire that fell did so because someone else seized the root. To understand the modern world, its power, its inequality, its patterns, we must look not at nations, but at the single artery of trade that rerouted history itself. To see how this happened, we must return to a time when the world was far bigger, far more fragmented, and far slower, long before satellites stitched the planet together. The Earth was a mosaic of isolated worlds: China, India, Persia, Europe. And the kingdoms of Africa and Arabia each grew independently, separated by mountains, deserts, and oceans that acted like walls. Geography wasn't just background, it was destiny. The Himalayas were an unbreakable barrier. The Sahara was a sea of death. The Arabian deserts isolated the peninsula from African wealth. Civilizations grew like islands, each believing it was the center of everything because it had never seen anything else but humans. Our restless curiosity and ambition pushed people to seek what lay beyond the horizon. Slowly, painfully, they carved out paths, primitive routes that would one day become the veins of global power, and none would become as important as the Silk Road. When people talk about the Silk Road, they imagine a single line from China to Rome, but it was a vast network, a sprawling constellation of paths stretching over 6,500 kilometers. It started in the ancient Chinese capitals, then split through the Taklamakan Desert, the Pamir Mountains, the steppes of Central Asia, Persia, Mesopotamia, and finally, the Mediterranean. Along these routes came goods that Europe had never imagined: silk so fine it seemed alive, porcelain that rang like bells, spices that transformed food into wealth. But the Silk Road carried more than objects. It carried ideas. Buddhism traveled from India to China. Islam spread from Arabia into Central Asia. Chinese technologies like the compass, gunpowder, and paper-making drifted westward, connecting worlds that had developed separately for thousands of years. But the Silk Road was also a trap. Its power didn't belong to the merchants, it belonged to whoever controlled the chokepoints. The road passed through dozens of states, each one taxing caravans, demanding tribute, or offering protection. By the 1400s, the western part of the road was dominated by one great superpower, the Ottoman Empire. For Europeans, this was a nightmare. They wanted Eastern goods desperately, but every cargo was inflated by layers of Ottoman taxation. Europe wasn't just buying spices, it was buying access, and the Ottomans knew it. A continent with ambition was suffocating under the weight of a trade route it did not control. And power always shifts when pressure becomes unbearable. Europe needed one thing: a way around the Silk Road. If they could reach Asia directly by sea, they wouldn't just become wealthier, they would change the world. Portugal became the spearhead of this movement. Small, poorer than its neighbors, but filled with master navigators and driven by pure desperation. Throughout the 1400s, Portuguese ships pushed farther and farther down the African coastline. Every voyage was a gamble. Many expeditions vanished without a trace. But the prize was too great to ignore. And in 1498, after decades of attempts, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea. This single event was more than a discovery. It was the collapse of a world system. It was the death of the Silk Road monopoly. It was the beginning of European dominance. It was the moment the world map shattered and reassembled itself around the oceans. Europe had broken the land route. And in doing so, it rewired global power. When Vasco da Gama reached India, he arrived in the middle of a global economic system that had never imagined Europe as a competitor. For centuries, the Indian Ocean had been dominated by Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants. Ports like Calicut, Hormuz, and Malacca formed an interconnected maritime economy far older and richer than anything in Europe. But the Europeans had two advantages: naval firepower and desperation. They had spent centuries perfecting military ships and naval artillery. They did not arrive as equal participants. They arrived as disruptors. Portugal quickly realized the Indian Ocean had no unified military power capable of resisting a coordinated naval assault. They exploited this fragmentation with ruthless efficiency. They captured strategic ports, built fortresses, and imposed something unheard of, a naval tax license called the cartas. Any ship without it could be destroyed. In less than a generation, Portugal, a tiny kingdom of fewer than 2 million people, seized control over a trade system serving half the world's population. Land routes were now obsolete. Sea routes were the future. Power belongs to whoever controls the shortest, safest, and fastest route to wealth. This was the first modern geopolitical formula. Once Portugal proved the model worked, Spain, the Dutch, and Britain accelerated the process. The Dutch perfected the art of maritime empire. Their East India Company, or VOC, founded in 1602, became the world's first true multinational corporation. It had its own army, currency, and the power to wage war. Its mission was control. Control of ports, spices, and shipping lanes. Their strategy was brilliantly simple: dominate one route, then dominate everything that flows through it. At its peak, the VOC accounted for nearly half of global trade. But the Dutch were only a stepping stone. The greatest maritime empire was yet to come. By the 18th century, Britain emerged as the dominant naval force on Earth. But Britain's true power came from something deeper than cannons: a global network of interconnected ports. From Hong Kong to Bombay, from Singapore to Alexandria, Britain created a system where goods, mail, and soldiers flowed continuously. It wasn't just an empire of land, it was an empire of routes. Controlling routes means controlling time, cost, efficiency, and profit. The British Empire understood the world as a machine, and trade routes as the gears that turned it. Through all this, one dream lingered: a shortcut. Ships sailing from Europe to Asia still had to travel around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, a brutal, long, and unpredictable route. The dream of a shortcut through the Middle East persisted for centuries. That changed in the 19th century. French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps launched one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history: the Suez Canal. Imagine a single cut through the desert, a waterway nearly 200 kilometers long connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the impact was immediate and world-shaking. The travel time between London and Bombay was nearly cut in half. Trade volumes exploded. Shipping routes realigned overnight. And the canal instantly became one of the most valuable strategic assets on Earth. Britain, recognizing its importance, quickly secured control first through investment, then through military intervention. The Suez Canal wasn't just important. It was a pivot, a hinge upon which global power swung. The Ottoman Empire weakened. Egypt fell under European influence. India became even more tightly integrated into Britain's global system. The Mediterranean regained its ancient significance as a central hub of global trade. A narrow trench cut through desert had reshaped the world map more dramatically than many wars. And it signaled a deep truth: trade routes are the invisible levers that move history. The opening of the Suez Canal didn't just change the speed of travel, it changed the speed of power itself. Before the canal, an empire expanded slowly. Troops took months to arrive. Information lagged. Economies reacted gradually. After the canal, everything accelerated. Ships arrived in weeks instead of months. Military reinforcements could cross continents at unprecedented speed. Political crises erupted and resolved faster. The world was moving from an age of geographical isolation to an age of geographical compression. And in this new, compressed world, the nations that controlled the shortest routes, the chokepoints, dominated global affairs. Every trade route has pressure points, narrow passages where the flow of goods is forced through a tiny geographic bottleneck. These are called chokepoints, and they are the real heart of global power. The ancient Silk Road had land chokepoints like Samarkand. The maritime networks of the Indian Ocean had the Strait of Hormuz. But after the opening of the Suez Canal, a new hierarchy of chokepoints emerged: the Suez Canal itself, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Panama Canal, and others. The Suez Canal sat at the top because it bridged the most economically dense regions of the world: Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But the deeper significance of the canal was psychological. It made nations realize how fragile their power truly was. If a single trench could change the entire global order, then power wasn't just rooted in land or armies. It was rooted in connectivity. By the early 20th century, something remarkable had happened. Trade routes had connected the world into a single economic system. Factories in Manchester depended on cotton from India. Tea plantations in Ceylon relied on European demand. American railways depended on steel from Britain. For the first time in human history, economic shockwaves could travel across continents. A drought in India could raise food prices in London. A banking panic in New York could devastate trade in Shanghai. Trade routes had made the world prosper, but they had also made it vulnerable. When World War I erupted in 1914, this global network of trade routes collapsed like a house of cards. Shipping lanes were patrolled, supply chains broke apart, and global trade dropped sharply. Nations suddenly realized that relying on faraway trade partners could be fatal. The war revealed an uncomfortable truth: a globalized world is efficient, but not resilient. After the war, globalization rebuilt itself. But the shadow of vulnerability never disappeared. During World War II, this weakness resurfaced with violent clarity. Japan, desperate for oil, targeted Southeast Asia specifically because it lay along crucial trade routes. Germany tried to choke Britain by cutting its Atlantic supply lines. The Allies fought for control of the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. Trade routes were not just background infrastructure, they were the battlefield. When the war ended, world leaders understood something critical. For the world to prosper, it needed secure, efficient trade routes, and fast. Ports were rebuilt, canals modernized, and fleets expanded. But the most revolutionary transformation came in the 1950s with one invention: the shipping container. This simple metal box changed global trade more than any war or treaty. Before containers, loading a ship took days. With containers, it took hours. Shipping costs plummeted. A product could now be manufactured in Japan, finished in Korea, assembled in Malaysia, and sold in Germany with minimal friction. And once again, everything depended on the routes. Because container ships travel only through certain deepwater channels, this created a new hierarchy of choke points: the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Taiwan Strait, and the Panama Canal. Because these are unavoidable routes, they became strategic pivot points in global politics. If one failed, the entire system would crack. And in 2021, the world witnessed this exact scenario. A single container ship of Ever Given became stuck in the Suez Canal. Just one ship, one accident. But the entire world economy stumbled. Billions of dollars were lost every day. Oil prices spiked. Supply chains froze. Factories paused production. One ship, stuck in one place for 1 week, proved that the arteries of global power were thinner than anyone imagined. The incident exposed the uncomfortable truth that global trade was a system held together by a handful of narrow corridors, fragile, overburdened, and dangerously concentrated. This forced leaders to confront a question that had been quietly growing for decades: what happens when the world becomes too connected for its own stability? After World War II, two superpowers emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S., with its unmatched navy, used its fleets to secure global shipping lanes, ensuring that goods could move openly and cheaply. This wasn't generosity. It was strategy. Controlling safe trade meant controlling global influence. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, built a land-based empire, dependent on pipelines and railways, insulated from maritime competition. But beneath the Cold War rivalry, global trade was expanding at a scale never seen before. The world had become a web, and every string mattered. Then, starting in the late 20th century, Asia became the new engine of global production. Japan first, then South Korea, Taiwan, and finally China. Factories multiplied, exports surged, and container ships grew into floating cities. Suddenly, the Strait of Malacca, a narrow passage between Malaysia and Indonesia, became the key route linking the oil fields of the Middle East with the factories of East Asia. Today, 1/3 of all global trade passes through this single choke point, which is less than 3 kilometers wide at its tightest point. Its importance is almost impossible to exaggerate. If the Strait of Malacca were blocked, China's energy supply would collapse, Japan and South Korea would face an immediate crisis, and the entire global economy would shudder. This is the pattern we see over and over. When a route becomes indispensable, it becomes a vulnerability. Every dominant power in history has faced this dilemma. Routes that bring wealth also bring dependence. The Silk Road made ancient empires rich but vulnerable to raids. The British Empire depended on the Suez Canal and nearly lost control of it multiple times. Modern economies depend on semiconductor supplies through Taiwan, oil through Hormuz, and consumer goods through Malacca. This fragility changes how nations behave. Trade routes are no longer passive pathways, they are strategic assets to be fought over, fortified, and used as leverage. No country understands this more than China. Its entire industrial system depends on imported energy, with nearly 80% of its oil flowing through the Strait of Malacca, a bottleneck historically patrolled by the U.S. Navy. This dependence is known inside China as the Malacca Dilemma. So, China developed the Belt and Road Initiative, a colossal network of railways, pipelines, ports, and highways spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe. Its purpose is simple: create new routes, reduce vulnerability, and gain influence over choke points. The BRI isn't just an economic project, it's a geopolitical shield. This brings us back to the core theme: trade routes create power. Control of trade routes creates dominance. Loss of trade routes creates collapse. Look at nearly every major conflict of the last 200 years: the Suez Crisis, Persian Gulf tensions, piracy off Somalia, conflicts in the Red Sea, and the rivalry around Taiwan. All of them, in different ways, are battles over routes, not just territories. Goods, energy, data, and money all must travel. And where they travel determines who gets rich, who gets poor, who gains influence, and who loses it. Nations are not just shaped by their borders. They are shaped by their access.